"Why is my wife in this photograph on your wall?" The question came out as a whisper, but it cut through the tiny apartment like cold steel. Jonathan Hale stood frozen in the doorway, his hands still resting on the chipped wooden frame of the door, as though he had forgotten why he had come there in the first place. The hallway light behind him cast a pale glow across the cramped living room, revealing peeling paint, a second-hand couch, and a small dining table that looked older than the building itself. But none of that mattered now. His eyes were locked on the photograph hanging on the wall directly across from him. The frame was simple and worn, but the image inside it was unmistakable. A woman with warm eyes and soft blonde hair knelt beside a young black girl who could not have been older than 10 years old. The woman had one arm wrapped gently around the child, as if shielding her from the world. Jonathan felt the air leave his lungs because he knew that face better than his own reflection. The woman in the photograph was Elena Hale. His wife, Maya Carter, stood near the kitchen counter holding a dish towel that she had forgotten to set down. Her shoulders stiffened when she realized what he had seen. She had expected many things that evening: anger, confusion, maybe even humiliation, but she had not expected him to notice the photograph so quickly. The billionaire stepped closer to the wall, each slow step echoing across the quiet apartment floor. Outside, a police siren wailed somewhere down the street, but inside the room, everything felt strangely still. Jonathan raised his hand toward the frame, but stopped just before touching it. His voice dropped lower, almost fragile. "Why is my wife there?" Maya did not answer immediately. She looked at the photograph instead of at him, as though the picture carried memories too heavy to speak aloud. The silence between them stretched long enough for Jonathan to hear the faint ticking of a cheap plastic clock mounted above the kitchen sink. He had arrived at the apartment less than 10 minutes earlier with a very simple purpose. Earlier that afternoon, a misunderstanding at his mansion had placed Maya Carter, the quiet maid who had worked in his home for several months, at the center of a heated argument. One of the house managers believed she had taken something valuable from the study, and Jonathan had come personally to settle the matter before the situation turned into a legal disaster. He had expected a quick conversation and a signed termination paper. Instead, he had walked into a mystery that made no sense, because the woman smiling in that photograph had been gone from this world for 5 years. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Jonathan finally lowered his hand from the frame and turned slowly toward Maya Carter. His sharp gray eyes searched her face, as if trying to solve a puzzle that refused to fit together. He studied the small apartment again, the narrow windows, the faded carpet, the single lamp casting warm light across the room. Nothing about this place connected to the life he knew nothing about. It explained why the most important person he had ever loved was staring back at him from that wall. Maya folded the dish towel, slowly placing it on the counter with careful hands, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "That photograph is the reason I survived." Jonathan felt something cold move through his chest. He looked back at the image of his wife, holding the small, frightened girl, and for the first time, he noticed the expression on Elena's face. It was not the confident smile that had filled charity galas and society magazines. It was softer, more protective, the look of someone shielding a child from a storm. Jonathan swallowed slowly, because a thought had begun forming in the back of his mind, a thought that made the room feel smaller and the past suddenly much closer than it should have been. Then Maya said something that made his heart stop. "You really do not remember that night, do you?" Jonathan Hale did not move for several seconds after Maya spoke those words. The small apartment seemed to shrink around him as the meaning of her sentence echoed inside his head. "You really do not remember that night, do you?" The billionaire slowly turned his gaze from the photograph back to Maya Carter, studying her face with a careful intensity, as if searching for something hidden beneath the calm expression she wore. She stood quietly beside the kitchen counter, her posture straight, yet relaxed, her dark eyes steady, but not confrontational. The dish towel she had set down moments earlier lay folded beside the sink, and the soft yellow light from the single lamp cast long shadows across the worn floorboards. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "I do not understand what you mean." His mind was already racing through memories of the past years, through charity galas, hospital fundraisers, and the dozens of public events where Elena had stood beside him smiling warmly for cameras. Yet none of those memories contained the photograph on that wall. None of them showed Elena kneeling beside a frightened child in what looked like an empty alley behind a brick building. Maya walked slowly toward the photograph, and stopped beneath it. She did not touch the frame, but her eyes rested on the image with a quiet familiarity as though she had looked at it every day for many years. You said earlier that you came here because someone in your house believed I stole something, she said gently. That is why you were going to fire me tonight. Jonathan nodded once the motion felt stiff, as if his body had forgotten how to move naturally. That was correct, he replied. My manager believed an item from my study had been taken, and your name appeared on the schedule that day. I came here to settle the matter quickly. Maya gave a small thoughtful nod, as if she had expected that answer. The accusation did not seem to offend her as much as it puzzled him. Most people in her position would have argued or raised their voice, but Maya Carter had done neither. Instead, she turned slightly and looked back at the photograph again. That night, she continued softly, had nothing to do with stealing anything. The night I am talking about happened many years before you ever hired me. Jonathan felt a faint pressure behind his eyes. The room smelled faintly of soap and old wood, and the sound of distant traffic drifted through the thin window glass. He folded his arms slowly across his chest, an unconscious gesture of control. Then tell me what night you were talking about, he said. Maya inhaled slowly before speaking, as if opening a door that had been closed. For a long time, 15 years ago, she began. There was a storm moving across the city, the kind that flooded the streets and pushed cold wine through every alley. I was a child back then, maybe 10 years old. I had been sleeping behind a restaurant dumpster because it was the only place that blocked the rain. Jonathan blinked once, the image forming in his mind, before he could stop it. Maya continued, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that seemed older than her years. A car pulled into the alley late that night. The headlights were bright enough to turn the rain into silver lines in the air. I remember covering my eyes because the light hurt. After the engine stopped, a woman stepped out of the car. She was wearing a long coat, and she looked completely out of place in that alley. Jonathan felt his heart beat harder, though he still did not know why. What did she want, he asked quietly. Maya answered without hesitation. She wanted to help. The simple sentence hung in the air between them. Maya looked up at the photograph again. Her fingers finally lifted and gently touched the edge of the frame. That woman did not know me, she said. She did not ask for anything. She only asked one question. Are you hungry? Jonathan felt something inside his chest tighten. Maya continued describing the memory. The woman had taken off her coat and wrapped it around the shivering child before guiding her into the warm car. The heater had filled the vehicle with soft air and the scent of lavender perfume. The woman drove to a diner that stayed open all night and ordered a plate of eggs, toast, and hot chocolate for the girl who had not eaten properly in days. She sat there quietly across the table watching the child eat, as if the moment mattered more than anything else in the world. Jonathan swallowed slowly, because the details sounded strangely familiar, but the connection still refused to form in his mind. After Maya finished describing the diner, she turned back toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman who did that for me was Elena Hale, your wife. Jonathan looked at the photograph again, at the gentle expression on Elena's face, and a deep, unsettling realization began to stir somewhere in the back of his memory. Then Maya said something that made the room fall silent again. That night was not the only time she came back. Jonathan Hale felt the quiet weight of the room pressing against his chest. After Maya finished speaking, that night was not the only time she came back. The sentence echoed through his mind in a way that made the air feel heavier than before. He looked once more at the photograph on the wall, then back at Maya Carter, trying to connect the woman standing in front of him with the frightened child from the story she had just told. The idea seemed impossible, yet the calm certainty in her voice left very little room for doubt. Jonathan slowly pulled out the chair beside the small dining table and sat down. His movements were careful, almost automatic, as if his body needed something solid beneath him, while his thoughts struggled to keep up. My wife returned to that alley, he asked quietly. Maya nodded once. Yes, she said. She came back the following week and the week after that too. At first I thought she was only being kind for one night, but she kept coming. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes never leaving Maya. What did she do when she came back, he asked. Maya folded her hands together gently. As she spoke, she brought food, sometimes sandwiches, sometimes hot soup in containers from a restaurant down the street. She would sit with me beside the wall of the alley and ask me questions. She asked about my name, my favorite subjects in school, and what I Wanted to be when I grew up. Jonathan frowned slightly. You were still going to school then? Maya gave a small nod. When I could, she said quietly. Some days I attended classes at the public school a few blocks away. Other days I did not have the strength or the clean clothes to go. Elena noticed that after the third time she saw me, Jonathan inhaled slowly. The mention of his wife's name, spoken so naturally by a stranger, still felt strange. Maya continued, describing the memories with careful detail. She said that children should not have to hide behind dumpsters to stay warm. Maya said she told me that every child deserved a safe bed and a chance to learn. The next week she returned with a backpack. Inside it were notebooks, pencils, and a pair of new shoes. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly as the image formed in his mind. Elena kneeling beside a small girl, tying the laces of brand new shoes in the middle of a dim alleyway. It was a side of his wife he did not remember clearly. He had always known Elena cared deeply about people. She supported charities and organized hospital visits, but those efforts had always been planned public events documented in newspapers and charity reports. This quiet, secret kindness felt different. Maya looked toward the window for a moment before continuing. Eventually, she told me she had spoken with the principal of the school I attended. She had arranged for me to receive meals at the cafeteria, even on days when I arrived late. She also paid for a small room in a shelter where I could sleep safely. Jonathan opened his eyes again, his expression slowly changing. Are you telling me my wife did all of that without telling anyone? Maya nodded. Yes, she did. She said kindness should not be performed like a show. She said that if helping someone becomes a performance, it stops being real. Jonathan felt the truth of those words settle deep inside his chest, because they sounded exactly like something Elena would say. Yet he had never heard that sentence before. He stood up slowly and walked back toward the photograph on the wall, studying it more closely. Now the picture captured a moment of warmth, Elena smiling gently while the young girl beside her looked shy but safe. Jonathan noticed something else now, something he had missed earlier in the photograph. Elena was holding a small camera in one hand, and the girl had one arm wrapped around her waist, as if afraid to let go. When was this photograph taken? He asked. Maya answered softly, that was the night she told me I would never have to sleep in that alley again. Jonathan felt his throat tighten as he realized the child in the photograph had been standing at the edge of a completely different life. Maya watched him carefully before speaking again. There was one more thing she said that night. Jonathan turned toward her slowly. What was it? Maya hesitated for a moment before answering. She said that one day if I ever met the man she loved, I should tell him something. Jonathan felt his heartbeat quicken despite himself. What was I supposed to hear? Maya looked directly into his eyes, now her voice calm but serious. She told me to tell you that she was sorry for keeping this secret. Jonathan Hale stood very still after Maya finished speaking the words she had just delivered, settled into the quiet apartment like a stone dropped into deep water. She told me to tell you that she was sorry for keeping this secret. The sentence echoed inside his mind again and again because it sounded so much like Elena, and yet it revealed a part of her life he had never known. Jonathan slowly lowered his gaze to the floor, the worn wooden boards creaking softly beneath his shoes. He had spent years believing he understood the woman he married. He had known her kindness, her patience, her steady belief that the world could still be better if someone was willing to care. But standing inside this small apartment, he was beginning to realize there had been entire chapters of her life that she carried quietly without ever placing them into his hands. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice softer than before. Why would she apologize to me for helping a child? Maya did not answer immediately. She walked toward the small table where Jonathan had been sitting earlier and rested one hand against the back of the chair as if grounding herself in the moment. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm but thoughtful. She did not apologize because she helped me. She said she apologized because she believed you might feel hurt, that she kept something important from you. Jonathan slowly lifted his head. Hurt, he repeated. Maya nodded once. She said that you trusted each other with everything. She said that secrets were the one thing that could place distance between two people who loved each other deeply. Jonathan felt a quiet ache rise in his chest because those words described exactly how his marriage had always been built. Elena had believed in honesty with a kind of gentle stubbornness that rarely bent. She used to say that trust was like glass. Once it cracked, it never looked the same again. Jonathan walked back toward the photograph on the wall, his steps slow and thoughtful. He studied Elena's face again, the softness in her eyes, the way her hand rested protectively on the shoulder of the young girl beside her. Maya continued speaking from behind him. She told me that if I ever met you, I should not tell you right away. She said I should only tell you when the moment felt right. Jonathan turned slightly toward her. And this moment feels right. Maya nodded quietly. Yes, she said, because tonight you came here believing I had taken something from you. Jonathan let out a faint breath. The truth of that statement stung more than he expected. Earlier that evening he had walked through the door of this apartment with a document prepared by his legal office ready to remove Maya Carter from his home and his company. Without hesitation, he had believed the report from his house manager, without questioning it deeply. Now, he stood in a room, filled with proof that the woman he loved had once trusted this same Maid with something far more meaningful than a job. Maya continued, her voice gentle but steady. Your wife once told me something that stayed with me for many years. She said that the measure of a person is not what they own, but what they protect. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, because the words felt painfully familiar. Elena had spoken sentences like that, often quiet truths that sounded simple, yet carried a depth that only revealed itself years later. He looked again at the photograph and noticed something he had overlooked before. There was a small handwritten message on the edge of the picture just beneath the frame. The ink had faded slightly with time, but the words were still visible. Jonathan stepped closer, squinting slightly as he read the delicate handwriting. To Maya, keep choosing light, even when the world feels dark. Elena. Jonathan felt his throat tighten, because he recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the same graceful script Elena used when she wrote notes to him on quiet mornings before he left for work. Maya watched him carefully before speaking again. She did not want recognition, she said softly. She only wanted to know that someone she helped would one day stand strong enough to help someone else. Jonathan slowly turned toward her again. His expression had changed. The sharp authority he carried when he first entered the apartment was gone, replaced by something more human, something uncertain. Maya met his gaze without hesitation. Then she said something that shifted the air in the room. Once more, the reason I applied for the job at your house was not the paycheck. The reason I applied for the job at your house was not the paycheck, Maya Carter said quietly. The sentence settled in the small apartment with a strange weight. Jonathan Hale felt something tighten inside his chest as he studied her face, trying to understand what she meant. Only a few minutes earlier he had walked through this door convinced he was dealing with a dishonest employee. Now every word she spoke seemed to open another hidden door in a past he did not recognize. Maya stepped closer to the photograph on the wall again. Her fingers rested lightly against the frame, but she did not remove it. I wanted to see her again, she continued. Her voice was calm, but there was something deeper in it, a quiet mixture of gratitude and longing. Jonathan frowned slightly. You applied to work in my house, just to see my wife? Maya gave a small nod. Yes, she said, but by the time I arrived, she was already gone. The air in the room shifted when she said those words. Jonathan looked down for a moment, remembering the day Elena died. The memory always came back in fragments. The hospital hallway, the quiet voice of the doctor, the moment when the world seemed to fall silent around him. It had been 5 years, but the ache still lived somewhere beneath the surface of his life. Maya continued speaking softly. I did not know she had passed away until my first week working there. She said one of the other housekeepers mentioned it when they saw the photograph I carried in my bag. Jonathan slowly walked toward the small table again, but he did not sit this time. His thoughts moved through memories of the large house on the hill, the empty spaces Elena had once filled with warmth and quiet laughter. He realized something strange as he listened to Maya. For months she had been walking through those same rooms, cleaning the floors, wiping the windows, moving silently through a place that had once meant everything to his wife. Yet he had barely noticed her existence. Why did you stay? Jonathan asked finally. Maya looked toward the window where the faint glow of a streetlight slipped through the thin curtains. For a moment, she seemed to be considering the question carefully before answering. Because leaving would have felt like turning my back on the person who changed my life, she said. Jonathan watched her closely. Maya turned back toward him and continued explaining, when Elena found me, I had already learned how invisible the world could make someone. A child sleeping behind restaurants does not exist to most people, but she saw me. She spoke to me like I mattered. She asked about my dreams, even though I did not believe dreams were meant for someone like me. Jonathan felt his throat tighten again. Maya's voice remained steady, but the meaning of her words carried a quiet strength. She did not just give me food or clothes. She said she gave me something more dangerous. She gave me hope. Jonathan leaned slightly against the table, his mind turning over the thought hope. He repeated, yes, Maya said, because hope forces you to imagine a life that feels impossible. And once you imagine that life, you cannot go back to believing you are invisible. Jonathan felt the truth of that statement settle deeply inside him. Maya continued, when I learned she had died, I almost left the job that same day, but something inside me told me to stay. A place where someone like Elena lived should not feel empty forever. Jonathan looked toward the photograph again. The image of his wife smiling beside a frightened child now felt different. It was no longer just a memory captured in a frame. It was proof that a part of her kindness had survived in the most unexpected way. Maya folded her hands together as she finished speaking. I stayed because I wanted to protect the house she loved, she said quietly. Jonathan lifted his head slowly. What do you mean protect? Maya hesitated for a brief moment before answering. Because not everyone in that house honors the kind of person she was. Jonathan felt a sudden chill move through the room. Then Maya said something that made his mind sharpen with concern. The item your manager believes I stole was never in danger. It was already being taken by someone else. The item your manager believes I stole was never in danger. It was already being taken by someone else, Maya Carter said quietly. The words settled over the small apartment like a slow-moving shadow. Jonathan Hale straightened immediately, the calm heaviness in his posture replaced by sharp attention. For a moment the billionaire did not speak, because his mind was already moving through the rooms of his mansion, remembering the object that had caused the entire accusation. Earlier that afternoon his house manager had reported that a small locked case from his study had been opened. Inside that case was a silver pendant that once belonged to Elena Hale. It was one of the few personal items Jonathan had kept in the same place since her passing. He rarely opened the case himself, but the thought of losing it had triggered an immediate response. That was why he had come to this apartment with termination papers in hand. Now he looked directly at Maya, his voice controlled but tense. What exactly are you saying? Maya met his gaze without hesitation. I am saying that the pendant from your study was already in someone else's hand when I saw it. Jonathan felt his chest tighten slightly. Who? Maya did not answer right away. Instead, she walked slowly toward the small kitchen window and looked out at the quiet street below. The glow from the streetlight painted a soft golden reflection across the glass. The city at night hummed with distant traffic and the faint rumble of a bus turning somewhere down the block. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but careful. I did not want person scheduled to clean the study. Jonathan nodded slowly. That was correct. Maya walked back toward the table where Jonathan had been standing earlier. Her movements were calm but deliberate. The morning the pendant disappeared, I was cleaning the hallway outside the study, she explained. The door was partly open. I saw Daniel inside the room. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. What was he doing? He was holding the pendant case, Maya said softly. Jonathan felt his jaw tighten. Daniel had the authority to enter the study, but removing personal items from the case was not part of his duties. Maya continued speaking. I did not step inside the room, she said. I stayed in the hallway, but I saw him remove the pendant from the case and place it in his pocket. Jonathan stared at her, trying to measure every detail of her expression. Why did you not report that immediately? He asked. Maya lowered her gaze briefly before answering. Because I did not want to believe that someone who worked in Elena's home would steal something that belonged to her. The sincerity in her voice filled the room. Jonathan walked slowly toward the photograph, again his mind racing through everything he had heard. Daniel Whitaker had been trusted for years, yet trust could sometimes hide behind careful appearances. Maya spoke again, breaking the silence. I also remembered something Elena once told me. Jonathan turned toward her. What was that? She said that truth does not always shout, she said. Sometimes it waits quietly until someone has the Carter. Words settled into the quiet apartment with a weight that made Jonathan Hale feel as if the floor beneath him had shifted. Because that pendant was never meant to stay in the case. Elena planned to give it to someone else. Jonathan stared at her for a long moment, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The silver pendant had been one of the few personal items Elena kept close to her heart during their marriage. He had seen it resting on her dresser many evenings after charity events or quiet dinners at home. It was a simple piece shaped like a small oval with delicate engraving along the edge. Inside, it held a tiny photograph that Jonathan had never fully examined because Elena once told him it was a reminder of someone she promised to protect. He had respected that privacy without asking questions. Now standing inside Maya's small apartment, he felt a strange realization beginning to form slowly in his mind. Who was she planning to give it to? Jonathan asked, his Voice lower than before. Maya did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked back toward the photograph on the wall and studied it for a moment. The image of Elena smiling beside the young girl seemed to glow softly in the dim light of the room. Finally, Maya turned back toward him. Her expression was calm, but there was a quiet seriousness in her eyes. She planned to give it to me. Jonathan felt the words strike him like a sudden gust of cold wind. He repeated. Maya nodded once. Yes, Elena told me that the pendant belonged to someone who survived something difficult. She said the person who carried it needed to remember that kindness could exist even in the darkest places. Jonathan moved slowly toward the chair again, but he did not sit. His thoughts were racing through memories of Elena, words and gestures, small moments that once seemed ordinary, but now felt filled with hidden meaning. Why did she want you to have it? He asked. Maya folded her hands together in front of her. Elena once told me that every person deserves a symbol of the moment their life changed. She said the pendant had been given to her by her grandmother. When she was a child, her grandmother told her that the locket represented courage and compassion. Jonathan listened carefully. Maya continued. She told me that if I ever reached a place where I believed in my own future, she would pass the pendant to me, so I would never forget where that future began. Jonathan felt the quiet weight of those words settle inside his chest. The idea sounded exactly like something Elena would believe, and she always found ways to turn ordinary objects into symbols of hope. But something about the situation still troubled him deeply. If she planned to give it to you, he said slowly, why was it still in my study all these years? Maya's expression softened slightly. Because the moment never came, she said. Jonathan frowned. What do you mean? Elena planned to visit the shelter where I lived after I started school. Maya explained. She told me that once I completed my first full year of classes, she would give me the pendant as a reminder that my life was moving forward. But a few weeks before that day, she stopped coming. Jonathan felt his chest tighten because he already knew the reason. The accident. Maya continued, speaking gently. At first, I thought she had simply become busy, but when I learned about her passing years later, I understood that the promise had been left unfinished. The apartment grew quiet again, the distant sound of traffic drifting faintly through the window. Jonathan looked at the photograph, once more imagining Elena standing in the alley beside a frightened child, holding a promise she never had the chance to fulfill. Maya's voice broke the silence again. That is why I knew Daniel Whitaker should never have touched that pendant. She said it was never just jewelry. It was a promise. Jonathan slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. A promise that was never completed. Maya nodded softly. Yes, she said. And when I saw Daniel take it from the case, I realized something else. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken slightly. What was that? Maya's voice lowered, but remained steady. He was not stealing the pendant to sell it. He was taking it because he knew exactly who it was meant for. Jonathan Hale felt the silence deepen after Maya Carter finished speaking. He was not stealing the pendant to sell it. He was taking it because he knew exactly who it was meant for. The words lingered in the small apartment like a quiet storm waiting to break. Jonathan stared at her, trying to understand the meaning behind the calm certainty in her voice. The thought that Daniel Whitaker might know something about the pendant that even he did not know made a strange unease settle in his chest. Jonathan slowly moved toward the window and looked out at the dim street below. The city lights reflected faintly against the glass, while distant traffic murmured through the night. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet tension. How could Daniel Whitaker possibly know that Elena intended the pendant for you? Maya remained still near the photograph. Her eyes rested on the frame for a moment before she answered. Because Elena told someone about me. Jonathan turned from the window immediately. Who? Maya hesitated only briefly before responding. She told Daniel Whitaker. Jonathan blinked slowly, trying to process that answer. Daniel Whitaker had served as estate manager for years, but Elena had rarely discussed private matters with the household staff. At least that was what Jonathan had always assumed. Why would she tell him? Jonathan asked. Maya took a slow breath. Elena trusted him at the time. She said she believed he was loyal and careful with personal matters. She once told me that Daniel handled many details for the house when you were traveling for work. Jonathan could not deny that statement. In the early years of his business expansion, he had spent long weeks flying between cities while Elena remained at the estate, organizing charity events and community programs. During that time, Daniel Whitaker had often assisted her with scheduling and household logistics. Jonathan felt a quiet uneasiness growing as Maya continued speaking. One evening, Elena visited the shelter where I lived, and she brought Daniel with her. Maya said he waited in the car while she spoke with me. but before she left she explained to him why the visit mattered. Jonathan frowned slightly. What did she tell him? She told him that the girl she met in that alley had become important to her. Maya replied. She said she planned to support my education quietly, and that one day, she hoped to give me something meaningful to remind me that my life had changed. Jonathan folded his arms slowly. His thoughts were now racing through memories of Daniel Whitaker. Polite voice, careful posture, and constant presence in the background of the estate. The idea that the manager might have known about Maya all these years unsettled him deeply. Maya continued speaking. I did not know. Daniel remembered that conversation until the morning the pendant disappeared. She said. Jonathan looked at her sharply. What happened that morning? Maya lowered her gaze, briefly recalling the moment. I was cleaning the hallway outside the study. She said the door was partly open. Daniel was standing inside holding the pendant case. When he saw me, he looked surprised, but not frightened. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. Did he say anything? Maya nodded. Yes, he asked me a question. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. What did he ask? Maya met his eyes again, her voice calm but serious. He asked if Elena had ever come back to see me. Jonathan felt a sudden chill move through his chest, because the question revealed something important. Daniel Whitaker had not forgotten that conversation from years earlier. Maya continued explaining. I told him that Elena had not returned after the accident, and that I only learned about her passing much later. She paused before finishing the memory. When I said that, he looked at the pendant in his hand and whispered something. Jonathan's breath slowed. What did he whisper? Maya answered quietly. He said, then this promise belongs to someone else now. Jonathan Hale stood motionless after hearing Maya Carter repeat the words Daniel Whitaker had whispered. Then this promise belongs to someone else now. The sentence carried a quiet weight that pressed against Jonathan's thoughts in a way he could not ignore. The apartment felt smaller than before, as though the truth surrounding Elena's memory had been slowly unfolding piece by piece until there was no space left for doubt. Jonathan walked slowly back toward the photograph on the wall. His eyes studied Elena's gentle smile again, but now that smile seemed to carry secrets he had never understood during the years they shared together. He spoke without turning around. Why would Daniel say the promise belonged to someone else? Maya remained calm, but there was a sadness in her expression, because she had asked herself the same question many times. I believe he misunderstood Elena's intentions, she said quietly. Jonathan turned slightly toward her. Explain. Maya stepped closer to the small table and rested her hand lightly against the chair back. Elena believed the pendant should be given to someone whose life had changed because of kindness. She said she believed that passing the pendant forward would keep that kindness alive. Jonathan listened carefully. Maya continued. When Daniel heard that Elena planned to give the pendant to me, he did not see it as a promise of compassion. He saw it as an opportunity. Jonathan felt his jaw tighten slowly. An opportunity. For what? Maya answered without hesitation. Control. She spoke the word softly, but it carried a sharp clarity. Jonathan walked to the center of the room, his mind working quickly. Daniel Whitaker had managed the estate finances and property logistics for many years. He knew every schedule, every storage key, and every personal detail connected to the house. But Jonathan had never once imagined that the quiet manager might view Elena's personal belongings as tools of influence. Maya watched Jonathan carefully before continuing. The morning I saw him holding the pendant, he did not look surprised that I recognized it. She said he looked as though he had been waiting for that moment. Jonathan frowned slightly. Waiting? Maya nodded yes, because when he asked if Elena had returned to see me, he was trying to confirm something. Jonathan folded his arms. What was he trying to confirm? Maya's voice remained steady. That I was the person Elena planned to give the pendant to. Jonathan felt the realization settle slowly in his chest. Daniel Whitaker had known about Maya. Years earlier, he had heard Elena explain the reason behind the pendant and the promise attached to it. When Elena died, that promise remained unfinished, and the pendant stayed locked in the study case. Jonathan spoke carefully. So when Daniel saw you working in the house, he realized exactly who you were. Maya nodded again. That is what I believe, she said. Jonathan walked back toward the table and finally sat down, the wooden chair creaking slightly beneath his weight. He rested his hands together and stared at the floor for several seconds before speaking again. If Daniel knew the pendant belonged to you, why would he accuse you of stealing it? Maya took a slow breath. Because removing me from the house would make it easier for him to control the story, she said. Jonathan looked up sharply. What story? Maya answered quietly. The story that no one was left to claim Elena's promise. The apartment grew silent again as Jonathan considered the possibility if Maya Carter were dismissed from the estate. Daniel Whitaker could easily claim that the pendant had been lost or misplaced, and no one would question the truth. Maya continued, speaking her voice calm but firm. I did not speak earlier because I needed to be certain, she said. Accusing someone without proof would only make the situation worse. Jonathan nodded slowly. Understanding the careful patience behind her decision, he looked once more at the photograph of Elena holding the young girl, and felt something shift inside him. Elena had always believed that truth revealed itself through courage, not through anger. Jonathan lifted his eyes to Maya again. If Daniel Whitaker believes the promise belongs to someone else now, he must believe he has the right to decide who receives the pendant. Maya's expression remained steady. Yes, she said, that is exactly what he believes. Jonathan felt a quiet determination begin to replace the confusion that had filled his mind since entering the apartment earlier in the evening. Then he asked the question that had been building in his thoughts since Maya first mentioned the pendant. Do you know who Daniel Whitaker believes the promise belongs to now? Maya hesitated for a moment before answering. Yes, she said softly, and that answer changes everything. Jonathan Hale watched Maya Carter carefully. After she said the answer changed everything, the quiet certainty in her voice carried a weight that made the air inside the small apartment feel heavier than before. Jonathan slowly stood from the wooden chair, the legs scraping softly against the worn floorboards as he rose. His mind had been racing through every possibility since the moment Maya first mentioned the pendant and Daniel Whitaker's name, but now he sensed that the truth waiting behind her next words might reshape everything he believed about the situation. Maya stood near the photograph of Elena, her eyes calm yet thoughtful, as though she had carried this knowledge for a long time. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice steady but tense. Then tell me, he said, who does Daniel Whitaker believe the promise belongs to now? Maya did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked once more at the photograph of Elena holding the frightened young girl in the alley. The gentle expression on Elena's face seemed almost alive in the dim light of the apartment, as though her presence had never fully left the room. Maya turned slowly back toward Jonathan. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear. He believes it belongs to you. Jonathan blinked once, the answer landing in his chest with unexpected force. To me, he repeated. Maya nodded. Yes, Daniel believes the pendant was never meant to be given to the girl Elena helped. He believes the pendant represents Elena's promise to you. Jonathan felt confusion spread across his face. That does not make sense, he said. Elena told you she intended to give the pendant to you. Maya stepped closer to the table, her hands resting lightly against the edge as she explained. Daniel Whitaker saw the situation differently. She said he believed that Elena's act of kindness toward me was only a chapter in a larger story. He believed the pendant represented Elena's final message to the person she loved most. Jonathan looked down for a moment, remembering the many conversations he and Elena once shared about compassion and responsibility. Elena often said that love did not belong only to private moments between two people, it belonged to the way a person carried kindness into the world. Maya continued, speaking softly. Daniel told me something the morning he saw me in the hallway outside the study. Jonathan raised his eyes again. What did he say? Maya's voice remained steady. He said that when Elena died, she left behind two unfinished promises. One promise was to the girl she rescued in the alley. The other promise was to the man she married. Jonathan felt a strange silence settle inside him as those words sank deeper into his thoughts. Maya continued, explaining. Daniel believed that if Elena could not complete the promise to give the pendant to me, then the symbol of that promise should remain with the person who shared her life. He believed that person was you. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight of Elena's memory pressing against him again. But that still does not explain why he accused you of stealing the pendant. Maya met his gaze calmly. Because Daniel Whitaker wanted the pendant to remain under his control. She said he believed that if the object stayed locked inside the study case, he could decide how Elena's memory would be interpreted. Jonathan frowned slightly. You mean he wanted to decide whether the promise belonged to you or to me? Maya nodded. Yes, she said. Jonathan walked toward the photograph again, his eyes resting on Elena's face. The realization that someone else had been quietly shaping the meaning of her memory inside his own home stirred a deep frustration within him. Maya's voice softened as she spoke again. But there is something Daniel Whitaker never understood. Jonathan turned toward her slowly. What is that? Maya looked directly into his eyes, her expression calm but certain. Elena's promises were never meant to divide people, she said. They were meant to bring people together. The apartment fell silent again. For several seconds Jonathan felt something inside his chest shift as he considered those words. Elena had never believed in choosing between compassion and love. She believed the two belonged side by side. Maya took a small breath before continuing. And there is one more thing Daniel Whitaker did not know. Jonathan studied her carefully. What is that, Maya? Voice lowered slightly because the truth behind her next sentence carried a deeper meaning. Elena did not leave the promise unfinished. She left it waiting for the right moment. Elena did not leave the promise unfinished. She left it waiting for the right moment. Maya Carter words lingered in the quiet apartment long after she spoke them. Jonathan Hale remained still beside the photograph of his wife, the soft glow from the lamp casting gentle shadows across the frame. He studied Elena's face again, but now he saw something different in her expression. Not only kindness, but intention, the kind of intention that belonged to a person who believed deeply that some moments in life needed time to unfold naturally. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. What do you mean, waiting for the right moment? Maya stepped closer to the photograph, her eyes resting on the image, as if it were a doorway to a memory that still lived somewhere inside her. When Elena visited the shelter during my first year of school, she told me something she had never said before. Maya explained. She said that kindness is never truly finished. It simply moves from one person to another until someone decides to carry it forward. Jonathan listened carefully, the words sounding painfully familiar. Elena had often spoken about compassion, as if it were something alive, something that traveled through people rather than belonging to them. Maya continued, speaking slowly, choosing each word with care. She told me that one day the pendant would find its way to the person who needed it most at the moment, when that person understood what it truly meant. Jonathan lowered his gaze briefly, the meaning beginning to settle inside him. You believe that moment is now? He asked. Maya nodded softly. Yes, I do. Jonathan looked around the small apartment, the worn furniture, the quiet dignity of the space, and the photograph that had started this entire conversation. Only hours earlier he had walked through this door believing Maya Carter might have stolen something from him. Now he realized she had been protecting something far more important. Elena promised. Maya reached into the pocket of her coat and removed a small folded piece of paper. Jonathan watched as she carefully opened it on the table. Between them the paper was slightly aged, the edges soft from years of being handled. Maya turned it toward him. You should read this, she said. Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes scanning the handwritten lines, immediately recognizing the graceful script. The note was written in Elena's familiar handwriting. My dear Jonathan, if you are reading this, it means that the promise I once told you about has finally come back into your life. The girl I told you about years ago, the one I found in the alley, is stronger than she believes. I asked Daniel Whitaker to keep something safe for me until the moment she returned to our home, because I knew one day she would. I want you to meet her not as someone who works in our house, but as someone whose courage reminded me why kindness matters. If that moment ever arrives, give her the pendant. It was never meant to stay locked away. It was meant to travel forward with the person who turned survival into strength. Jonathan felt the words blur slightly. As he finished reading, he lifted his eyes slowly toward Maya. The silence between them felt almost sacred now. Elena knew you would come back to the house, he said quietly. Maya nodded. She believed that the world has a way of bringing unfinished promises back to life. Jonathan looked down at the note again, feeling the quiet certainty behind Elena's handwriting. Daniel Whitaker had never understood that the promise was not his to control. It was not even Jonathan to guard forever. It was meant to move forward. Maya spoke softly, breaking the silence. I did not come to your house only because of a job, she said. I came because I wanted to know if the kindness that changed my life was still alive there. Jonathan looked at her with a new understanding, replacing the suspicion he once carried. It is, he said gently. Maya's expression softened slightly. Then the promise can finally be completed, she replied. Jonathan folded the note carefully and placed it back on the table between them. His voice was calm, but filled with quiet resolve. Then we will complete it tomorrow morning. The next morning, the sky above the Hale estate carried the pale blue light of early dawn. Jonathan Hale stood at the large window of his study, looking out across the quiet gardens where thin lines of mist hovered above the grass. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the antique clock on the far wall. A few hours earlier, he had barely slept because Elena's words written in that folded note kept returning to him again and again. The girl I told you about years ago, the one I found in the alley, is stronger than she believes. Jonathan slowly turned from the window and walked toward the study desk, resting his hand on the wooden surface where the silver pendant case had always been kept for years. The small object had remained locked away inside that case like a memory he was afraid to disturb. But today felt different. Today, the promise Elena described had finally returned to his life. A soft knock sounded on the study door. Jonathan looked up. "Come in," he said quietly. The door opened slowly, and Maya Carter stepped into the room. She wore the same calm expression she carried the night before, yet something about her posture felt different. There was less uncertainty in the way she stood, as though the conversation from the apartment had lifted a quiet weight from her shoulders. Jonathan gestured toward the chair near the desk. "Thank you for coming." Maya nodded and walked forward, her eyes briefly scanning the familiar room where she had spent months cleaning in silence. The morning sunlight slipped through the tall windows, filling the space with warm gold light. Jonathan reached for the small wooden case resting on the desk and opened it carefully. Inside, the silver pendant lay exactly where he had last seen it before the accusation had begun. The metal surface caught the light softly. Jonathan lifted the pendant in his hand and studied it for a moment. Elena's grandmother had once given it to her as a symbol of courage and compassion. Now he finally understood why she had protected it for so long. Jonathan walked slowly around the desk and stopped a few feet in front of Maya. "Elena believed that kindness should travel forward," he said softly. "She believed that one act of compassion could change a life, and that the person whose life changed would one day carry that kindness to someone else." Maya listened quietly. Jonathan extended his hand, holding the pendant toward her. "She believed that person was you." Maya looked at the pendant, her eyes reflecting the morning light. For a moment, she did not move, as though the weight of the promise felt almost too large to accept. Then she raised her hand slowly, and Jonathan placed the pendant gently in her palm. The silver surface rested there quietly, a symbol that had waited many years to find its path. Maya closed her fingers around it, her voice soft. "Thank you." Jonathan shook his head slightly. "No," he said quietly. "Elena asked me to do this." Maya looked toward the window, where the garden stretched beyond the glass. She spoke slowly, as if understanding something important. "I think she knew this moment would come one day." Jonathan nodded. "I believe she did." They stood in silence for a few seconds, the kind of silence that does not feel empty, but complete. Finally, Jonathan spoke again. "Maya Carter, I owe you an apology." Maya met his eyes. "For believing the accusation," he continued, "and for not seeing the truth sooner." Maya shook her head gently. "Elena once told me that truth arrives when people are ready to hear it," she said. Jonathan allowed himself a faint smile at the familiar wisdom in those words. Outside the window, the sun rose higher above the trees, sending warm light across the estate. Jonathan looked once more at the photograph on the desk of Elena smiling beside him years earlier. She had not changed the entire world with one quiet act of kindness, but she had changed one life, and that life now stood in front of him, holding the promise she left behind. Maya slipped the pendant carefully around her neck and looked toward the door, as if ready to step forward into the next chapter of her life. Jonathan watched her with quiet respect. Elena once told him that kindness was never wasted because it always found its way back home. And in that quiet morning light, Jonathan finally understood exactly what she meant.